very special guest with us today. As most people know, that CNTA has been around for quite a while, and when we celebrated our 25th anniversary 5 years ago, this is our 30th year in operation, we established a scholarship at Aiken Technical College for a second-year student that was in one of their radiation or technology programs. And we provide that student with a $1,000 scholarship. At least that's what we're doing this year. We're planning to do it in a fall and spring at $500 a year, starting next academic year. But so we've been doing that, and we're pleased to have with us today Lauren Stevens. Lauren is a second-year student in the Radiation Protection Technology program at Aiken Tech, and she was the recipient of our award this year. So I don't know if Lauren can unmute herself or say a couple words, say hi to everybody.
Hey everyone, I'm should be unmuted, and I hope everybody can hear me. It's an honor actually to receive this award. It was definitely unexpected. So any recognition is great. And I'm excited. I love this program. I love the school, the staff. It's been a great adventure so far.
Great. She's under the name Beth LeClaire, who's one of the staff members at Aiken Tech. But Lauren, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck. And we can't wait till you join the workforce and support what we're doing in our industry.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so let's now move into the program. And today we are really fortunate to have one of our own speak to us, Chuck Munns, Charles Chuck Munns. He currently serves as president of Munns Advisement. He served for 34 years in the U.S. Navy, attaining the rank of Vice Admiral. Admiral Munns was president and chief executive officer of Savannah River Nuclear Solutions from 2007 to 2009. He is now a commissioner at the South Carolina Commission for Higher Education, and he is one of our esteemed board members. Chuck received his bachelor's degree from the U.S. Naval Academy, his master's of science in computer science from the University of Colorado, and his corporate board director's continuing certificate from the University of Chicago School of Business. So Chuck, please take it away, and we look forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you, Jim and Allison. And this is indeed a strange way to give an up and atom. I would much rather be in front of you all, see you all, be able to raise that little red flag at Newberry Hall, so where they come and pour you some more coffee. That didn't seem to work on my desk this morning. So there's a lot that can be said about national security, and we could talk for hours, but I'm reminded of a story I learned when I was serving in Italy. And so with all due respect to our foreigners that maybe are here, the story was about a British admiral, a French Navy captain, and an American sailor. Sadly, in the Mediterranean, they were all captured as spies and sentenced to death by their capturer. But they were given one last wish, and so they started with the French captain, and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry for spying, but it's doing the best for my country. But I would like just one fine meal, a nice bottle of wine, a delicately prepared meal." "Okay," the captor said, "we can do that." And they turned to the British admiral, and he said, "Well, I'd just like the troops to be marched in front of me one last time, to be able to give a long and rousing speech." They said, I think we can do that." They turned to the American sailor. He said, "Well, I think, with all due respect, I'd just like to get my sentence finished before the admiral starts talking." And so with respect for your all's time, I hope to do this in about 20 minutes or so. But like Allison said, I'd be glad to take questions at the end. So national security 2021. And hopefully you're able to see my shared screen, and I just changed a slide to slide 2. So the assessment up front, and so it's about what I'll talk about is the assessment here, and let me find where I am. So anyway, it's bottom line is that our national security has diminished. This is what our national security assessment says, and I'll relate in a moment what that's about. But basically, it says national security advantage has diminished. We are vulnerable, and we must act. And so that's sort of the bottom line. And it's going to take a lot of things for us to be able to do that. So turning to the agenda, I'll talk first the landscape. By that I mean the world that we see, we as a country, we as people see in front of us today. Talk a little bit about that landscape, a few of the other competitors for us. Second, then turning to the National Defense Strategy, and those are formal documents. And I'll say when I get to that section, I'll say a moment about where they are and when they were published. Some current issues, and then lastly a slide with what we can all do. So the landscape. This is the evolution you see here on this screen, and we're now talking the world order 2021. So we've gone through many phases of the landscape of the world that we faced, and obviously we're just concentrating on today. But basically what our national defense strategy starts with is that the premise that we've evolved from a terrorism, 2 decades of fighting terrorism, to now, well, that hasn't gone away. The predominant effect is strategic competition, which is where we are today. And so basically it's China and Russia. They hope each to shape a world consistent with their own authoritative model, to control other nations, us included, to control our economic, diplomatic, and security decisions to benefit them. So it's all about this strategic competition. Secondly, they recognize that events and structures have deteriorated the World War II international order, the order, by the way, that we put in place. And so it's harder for us to have this competition than we did during the Cold War. The competition today is much like that fourth bullet there, the Cold War, although it's now also multi-state, not just the Soviet Union. In addition to being multi-state, it's also multi-factor. Many diffuse capabilities have to be dealt with today. Cyber, counter space, stealth, special operations forces, hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated world. The tagline at the bottom, Back to the Future, a node to the Cold War, but Back to the Future plus in many different ways. So let me spend then just this one slide and talk about sort of the challenges we faced. And then, as I said, we'll get into the strategy we have put in place to deal with those challenges. So first to China. It's clearly evolved in the last 2 decades and on a trajectory for much change going forward. China seeks internal control and stability. They do it with an authoritarian society. And frankly, and our strategy recognizes, they do it by, and I'll use the word stealing from us. They use state-funded industries and cyber espionage and a structure of people throughout the world to learn what we have learned, use that, refine it for their own purposes, for the effect of beating us economically. They've put together, as just one evidence of that, they've put together a national strategy. This is China national strategy to beat the world, to be the first in the world in key competencies. And they want to dominate the health industry, artificial intelligence, everything there is to know about DNA, quantum computing, rare earths, and the list goes on to about 20 different things. They use predatory economics to intimidate their majors, their neighbors, and this is again seen in their Belt and Roads Initiative, and that's a whole chapter that I won't dive into today for time. So a good strategy for us would be, and it's part of our strategy, confront, compete, and cooperate. So we will confront China. Our strategy says where they are focusing on regional hegemony and in human rights areas. We'll compete in trade, and we'll cooperate, if possible, in health and climate. Turning to Russia, Russia wants their place as they used to have it several decades ago. Obviously, they violated borders around their space. They operate in gray zone warfare against cyber, and I'll say a lot more about that later on. But that's solar. Let me just give the tagline now. The SolarWinds cyber attack that we went through in November, December, and January, and is ongoing, is huge. It's huge, and I and most are convinced it's Russian sponsored. So they want to destabilize our civil order. They want to stimulate our own distrust in our own institutions, thinking by tearing us down, then that elevates them and their position in the world. So those are the two biggest. We don't have time to talk as much of the others that are here. You can see them on the screen. But I do want to turn to the post-World War II order. This is under attack. This is NATO, this is the UN, this is our own partners, it's treaties. All of them have diminished over the last four years or so. And those are all institutions we put in place. And our national security strategy recognizes that and says we should try to turn that around. And so the strategy says, and in my view, I agree, the Department of Defense is here, and our best resort is that if we can posture to support the State Department, Intelligence Department, and Department of Homeland Security. So we'll say a little bit more about that. And then second from the bottom is degradation of our civil society, where mistrust is sowed, American against American, American against our own institutions. I've already said Russia is trying to do that, and others as well. And that's a part of the landscape that we have to deal with, our strategy. And then lastly, cyber, and I'll come back about that again. So all of these challenges are in place in the world today, and our security strategy must deal with them. Before turning to the strategy, let me just one more point about civil society shown on the chart here. And I gave a similar talk, I guess 2 years ago, and this chart actually is from then. It's from a Gallup poll 2 years ago, and I would offer things are probably are worse today. By worse, I mean our confidence, Americans' confidence in the institutions of Congress and the free press, even banking. Of course, that was during the time of Wells Fargo, and so part of our strategy is regaining some of that confidence. In fact, a recent economist, which I enjoy reading, says that only 37% of the Americans say that most people can be trusted, which is pretty sad. They claim that low trust societies, this is the economist, low trust societies have dysfunctional politics, weak economics, and people who live in them are less inclined to obey the law. So that's why this issue is part of our national security and defense strategy. Okay, so let me then turn, with that as preamble, and I'll spend maybe about 10 minutes on the defense strategy itself, as you see here on the slide. My source is the strategy. It was written and signed in 2018. And these documents are searchable. They're on at least the unclassed version is on the web. You can just search National Defense Strategy, and up will pop about a 30-page summary document of our strategy. So let's dive into it. The premise of that strategy shown here is that first we must and will compete in this world. We'll use all of our levers and compete against those competitors, which I alluded to already. Our strategy is to deter them from taking actions against our country, which is anathema to what we would want done. And we would protect ourselves, and then, if necessary, engage in conflict and win. So win obviously is very important, but it's actually the fourth piece. The first is that we should have a strategy to allow for this competition so that things play out in the way we would hope they would for our national interests. Second premise is that there is strategic atrophy. The distance we enjoyed in the Cold War, and certainly in the last 2 decades with terrorism, the distance of our strength versus others has atrophied. While we are still near the top, while we are still in a pretty good spot, that distance between us and our competitors has shrunk. And so that atrophy is of concern, and our strategy addresses that. Third is we can't do it alone. Anyone who thinks any one country could do this alone doesn't understand the world today. And so our strategy is one of a joint force where all of our services, Navy, Air Force, Marine, it's hard to count them all today, Space Force, Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Army, we all operate as a joint force and with allies and partners. And that's a particularly important piece. And lastly, and sadly, homeland, since 9/11, obviously our homeland is a target, and it's no longer a sanctuary. And as evidenced again by that SolarWinds cyber attack the last few months, an attack on our homeland, our structures in our homeland, clearly we're not in a sanctuary. So this is the 4 premises of our national defense strategy. The objectives is to obviously defend the United States. I've talked about deterring attack against either us or our vital interests, enabling the interagency. And so our strategy, our defense strategy, is to enable diplomacy, enable the intelligence communities so that we can all work together for advantages. And that's frankly, we didn't do that, haven't been doing that very well over the last few years. And so this is an important, but remember, this is a 2018 strategy. This is what the last 4 years were about. We do want favorable regional balances of power as shown there. We are obligated and committed to defending our allies. And again, that's for our own purposes. We must stop proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And we want free and open common domains. And as a naval officer, that's one that we particularly participate in. The oceans are a common domain. Space is a common domain. Cyber is a common domain. They should all remain open and free, and we should be allowed to maneuver in those areas. So those are the objectives. Now, the strategy says in order to fulfill those, we'll take some modernization. And so I'll show some charts in a moment, but it actually talks about modernization of these 7 points. This is our strategy. The first being the nuclear forces, the triad, and the NC3. And I'll show you a chart in a moment where we stand there. And so I'll talk about the specifics, and maybe we will get into some questions. But we need to modernize in space and cyber and communications, missile defense, and so on, as you see down the list, to include logistics. As Patton learned many, many years ago, logistics is the key to a successful campaign. And you'll see advanced autonomous systems. I had the opportunity to serve on a Department of Energy advisory board where Secretary of Energy asked us to look at artificial intelligence and machine learning and look at what all the national labs are doing and give him some advice as to what the Department of Energy should be doing. So anyway, that was a fun event, and it's clearly an important part of our modernization. Okay, so the approach. The approach for our strategy, and I guess I probably already said this because it comes right out of the premise, but is first and foremost nuclear deterrence. We must have a Department of Defense capability and strength so that we project nuclear deterrence. No competitor would ever think of attacking us because of what would happen if they did. And a good part of that is our nuclear deterrent. Our approach is global, unlike some of the other countries, but we operate best if we can operate around the world, not just along our own shores. Joint, I already mentioned. Interagency, I already mentioned. Our approach is talent. I'm always reminded of I had a chance when I was chief of staff out in the Pacific. The senior Chinese admiral came and visited, and I was a one-star admiral at the time, and I was just his escort. He was really there to meet with our four-star. But I toured him around the base, and he asked, who are all, when we went by the submarine piers, and he saw all those cars. He said, who owns all those cars? And I said, well, our sailors do. And we were talking through an interpreter, but he thought for a moment, and he said, well, if your sailors all have cars, why don't they just get in them and leave? I didn't know what to say at that point. I said something about an all-volunteer force, and they're eager to serve their country, and they're there to work, and of course they all have cars. But our people, our sailors, our soldiers, our airmen, our civilians are key to our military strength and our national strength. And so it's part of our approach. I've mentioned alliances and partners already. Let me then turn to a couple of these slides. Let me move my thumbnails of you all so I can see the whole thing. So these slides are referenced in the National Defense Strategy, and I think they're actually produced in the Nuclear Posture Review, which is a review that usually takes place every 4 years, along with the refresh of the defense strategy. Our new Secretary of Defense has said he intends to produce another defense strategy. I don't think it'll change much from what I'm saying here today. And there's likely to be another nuclear posture review. But these slides are enduring. I mean, these are facts. These are not specific to that particular study. So first, then, why nuclear? Why nuclear? Does deterrence work? And so the strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review and the strategy spend some time in saying, yes, deterrence works, and it's exactly the right thing for our strategy. So this is one proof. This slide shows wartime fatalities as a percent of total population, world population, along the timeline across the bottom. And so the ups and downs of 1 to 3% world population fatalities per year from 1600 to 1950 is the conventional era. The nuclear era starts in 1950, and you see the prompt drop in engagements and wars, world wars, down to less than 1/100% today. And so that's one of the evidences for, yes, the nuclear deterrent works, has worked, and still does work. Now, then it's often said, well, but we have too many, our nuclear deterrent is too big. We don't need, we ought to be able to take some reductions. This slide says we did. The peace dividend that came when the wall fell, we took. So this slide from the Federation of American Scientists shows size of arsenals, Soviet Union versus us, Russia versus us, over time. And the left-hand side is thousands of nuclear warheads. And so you see at the peak, Russia, Soviet Union at the time was up almost to 40,000. We were 25 to 30,000. We now have all come down to about 4,000 each. And we have a new START treaty, which limits the deployment of to less than 1,500 each. And so the note here is we have reduced, we are much less than we had been. And I would now, this is my opinion, but the document talks a little bit about it. I opine that to go less than this, less than where we are today, less than say 1,000, less than 1,500 deployed, makes the world much less stable because it reduces that deterrent effect that I've talked about already. So while we as a nation have signed up to treaties where we eventually would do away with nuclear weapons in the future, that's a long ways away. And so our strategy is dependent upon them. Our structures are dependent upon them. Well, then the next argument is, well, okay, so we're the big guy, and why do we need to build more, build new? This chart, again, was from in the 2018 document. This shows nuclear delivery systems built and delivered since 2010. Top line is Russia, then China, then North Korea, and then us. Ground launched, sea launched, and air launched nuclear delivery systems. You see that each of our competitors has been busy. Well, we have not. We have delivered one such system, air launched. Now, the good news is we have an appropriate number of systems in the pipeline to fill that red circle down at the bottom. We have a new ballistic missile submarine, which will replace the Trident. The Trident is 40 years old and not designed to go beyond that. We have a new bomber to replace our bombers. Our B-52s are older than we are. I don't have, I forgot the exact, but they're from the 50s. And even the B-2 is now 20 years old, and that airplane wasn't designed for much longer than that. And then the Minuteman is very old and needing repair and replacement. And so there's a ground-based strategic deterrent, GBSD, that's programmed and is budgeted for and has started to fill that circle. Now, one of the big questions for the next administration will be to what extent do we change any of those programs? But so the point here is we need to modernize. And lastly is, well, but it costs too much. The study says it can be done at a reasonable cost. This is again, across the bottom is years from 1962 to 2040. The left-hand margin is percent of Department of Defense budget, percent that the nuclear enterprise takes of the Department of Defense budget. And the gray over on the right is where we are today. Sustainment of the nuclear enterprise is about 2.7% of the budget. The recapitalization of those programs I just mentioned, ICBM, SLBM, and bomber, and communications, and it would take us up to would be a peak of 3.7%, as you see there in the chart. Less than the past, and certainly something that we as a great nation can afford, particularly if our security is dependent upon it. Okay, so that's very quickly our strategy. That's what it will take to do. That's justification of why it can be done, should be done. And so now let me just say there are a few other challenges of which you see here on the screen. And this could be a whole semester or a whole degree program at USC Aiken or Aiken Tech to go through each of these. And so I won't, but you'll see some of the other challenges to our security that are listed there. And but very important. We can't do this alone. Second is relationship with our competitors. And I got a little thing saying my internet connection is unstable. So Jim, can you still hear me? Yeah, I see a thumbs up. Great.
I can now, Chuck. I think we lost you in the end of the last slide.
Okay. I can see, so I can see Charlie. So Charlie, stay there. If I go away, then give me a signal. So the last slide, this was finances. Did I get enough on the finances?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So then other challenges shown here. And again, I don't have time to talk about those. So current issues. Renewed partnerships, NATO, working with other countries, working with the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, very important to our national defense. And we're off doing that. Department of Defense never stopped, but there were certainly some bumps and hiccups along the way there over the last few years. Relationships with our competitors are very important too. And so this is treaties. And you know, there's arguments whether treaties are good or not, but in my mind, they're crucial. And if you don't have a rule book, if you don't have some expectations of what the other is going to do, if you don't have mechanisms where you can inspect that they're living by those obligations, then it's a wild, wild west, and our security suffers. And so, re-emphasizing our role in NATO, very important. Last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, we extended the START talks, which is the nuclear warhead limit treaty with Russia. It had expired, and we extended that. Now, I believe it needs to be updated, and we need to include China. We need to do some other things, but it's very important that that treaty, in my view, and in the document's view, stays in place for our national security. Current issues. Let me talk a moment then about cyber posture, and we as a nation, and so I'll just talk about the solar wind attack that happened a few months ago. Well, actually started in June, I think, and is ongoing. It was on 60 Minutes a week or two ago, if some of you saw that, but we as a nation haven't paid enough attention to that. And an entity, I believe Russians, and our intelligence community believes Russians, used the pipes and plumbing of our internet to get into network control systems that allowed them to get into thousands, tens of thousands of our networks, of all of our agencies, and many of our industries, not all, but many of our agencies and many of our industries. And we still don't know what they did and what they placed there and what they took out. And so it's a huge effort to recover from that, to figure out why we didn't recognize it sooner, and to stop it from going forward. So cyber response and defense is a very, very important thing. And I'm very glad I saw Forrest Mahan on here, that his Aiken Tech is working a bit in this area and more. And USC Aiken has some cyber courses. USC, well, all of our institutions, all of our educational institutions are focusing on this. We are certainly, with Fort Gordon and Savannah Riverside, a key area for cyber. So it's particularly important. It's of interest to us and important to our national defense. Okay, I'm time check here. The sun is blocking my clock. Okay, let me speed up a little bit. But the last part of this slide is some other issues which will probably be discussed over this next few years, and they're not new. They were studied when this current national security strategy and defense strategy came out. To the extent to which we extend our deterrence to our friends is an issue. Size and modernization of our force, I just talked about that, whether we build those 3 new systems, which I think we must and are underway. Pit production is part of that. We have to have pits, which are the part of the nuclear weapon which makes the explosion, makes the nuclear explosion. It has to be reliable. And the current ones we have were built 40, 50 years ago. And so our nation has gone on a path where we say we must build 80 of those a year in order to maintain the deterrence that we have. These are not particularly new weapons. These are upgrading and making sure what we have works. And so the Savannah River site right now is part of that. We would make 50 of those 80 hits per year. Triad versus dyad. Basically, the discussion there is do we need ICBMs as part of our nuclear force? And there's lots of questions around that. And lastly, the authority, the posture of our forces and the authority to use them. Right now, it resides in the president. And so there are some real questions as to whether that should change and get more complicated, and there should be a check on that. And we'll see where that goes. Let me then end with just a few other thoughts, maybe 5 more minutes, and then I'm glad to take questions. So part of our strategy is to have a civil order which supports democracy, which then supports our national security. And so this by civil order, I mean protecting our processes, protecting elections, protecting lawmaking, protecting and having confidence in the people that run our country, in the confirmation process, and so on and so forth. Having a nation that engages with each other, that listens to each other, where we can discuss issues and compromise. That's the art of democracy. And all of that takes accurate information. When I said earlier that civil order has deteriorated, most of it is we have lost control of the information we speak from, and some speaking from things that aren't true, and that just destroys confidence and destroys our ability to talk to each other, and affects our national security. So I'm talking about this as a national security imperative. So I encourage us, and I'll say at the end, positive use of social media. Follow the golden rule. Very important. Okay, so that some of that is my soapbox I was on, but some of that is in the national defense strategy, and it is certainly on the mind of folks in our administration today. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had to send a message to all of his soldiers and sailors and airmen, reminding them, this was back in December and January, reminding them that they swore an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, not to any particular personality. For the fact that he had to send that is just sad and phenomenal. Important that he did, because that's exactly the right thing. But it shows how things, where we were at that point in time. So what can we do? Be an informed citizen. Support Fort Gordon and Savannah River site. They're key to our national security. We all need to work to help restore societal norms. And I think, the big there is words matter. What we all say to each other, what we all say on social media, whether it's based on fact or fiction, plays a big deal. So in summary, summary slide, our national security this is what our national defense strategy says. Our national security is threatened. It doesn't mean we're still in a good place, but we've lost the margin that we used to have. Our national security depends upon the things I list here. And I've talked about civil order, nuclear modernization, alliances, defeating the pandemic. I didn't say about that, but clearly it's part of this, and cyber resilience. So Jim, with that, I guess that was my last slide. I'd be glad to take questions.
Thank you so much, Chuck. That was excellent, and it really hits home, and I think it's a story we all need to hear and act on. We do have some time for some questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can either send something in the chat or raise your hand, or unmute yourself if you're able to unmute yourself, and we'll try to get to some questions. Do we have any questions or comments? Do you see that one, Chuck? The four-way test.
So then it's time for the test, huh? Oh, 3 new messages. Let me see.
Yeah, but you had one that says, what is the four-way test? And so.
Aha. Okay, great. I thought I actually had taken that out. It is what Rotarians live by. And I gave this presentation to Rotary 2 weeks or so ago. And so it's much like the golden rule, do unto others like you'd want others to do unto you. But it says, first, of the things that you think, or you say, or you do, is it the truth? And second, is it beneficial? And third, will build goodwill and for the world. And fourth, is it fair to all concerned? So those are kind of the premises that Rotary lives by, and I think any civic organization has things like that. But the key among those is it the truth, and is it fair to all concerned? And if what you're about to think or say or do or advocate is not the truth, then I would say don't do it. But you really got to think about the consequence and what are you trying to do, and so it goes back to, I think, the cohesiveness of our society and how we can all interact with each other. Great question, thank you. I think, let me see if I got one else.
One raised hand, Michelle Wells. You see that question? What about water, Chuck, and resources?
Let me just go down the list. I see one that says, early on, you mentioned about the importance of the UN. Do you still see that as valid? I see them as a platform that becomes more and more anti-US. So my answer is yes, it's important. And let me just relate my experience. This is NATO, not UN, but similar. And I had a NATO command in Italy. I had a US command also. I was the boss, and I had 2 separate staffs. So I did a lot with NATO. And every time NATO got together, we would sit in a big room. We would, a representative from each country was there, or at least each country that was participating in that event. And you would go around the table, you'd listen, you would hear, and I hoped you would listen to the perspectives of each of the countries. And they would talk about the issue from their own perspectives. But in the end, every time they would turn, if I was at the table to me, or if somebody else, they would turn to the American and say, what does the United States think? And we had an outsized influence on what that part of the world was doing, just based upon being in those meetings, being in the structure, participating, and I would say leading, because we were and clearly were. So the UN is the same way. If we're not there, we're not there. You look at some of the UN organizations where we got pulled out of, and they go on. They're not going to stop. They'll go on without our voice. They'll go on with our competitors, Russia, China, and others, influencing those organizations for their benefit. And if we're not there, the best way to prevent and stop that is to be there working from the inside. Now, that's my own opinion. It's opinion shared by many, but that would be my answer to that one. So the last line of that question says, or is this a case of keeping our enemies closer? I'd say exactly. That's exactly right. I described the 4-way test. What is a 4-way test? What about water? Yeah, that in my time, Cold War, it was oil, and I guess the last couple of years too, it was oil. I lived. I'm going to show my age, but as I'm looking at some of the faces here, we were all there together. We went through the 70 oil crisis together. Well, I think that in the future is water. You look at, again, I'll go back to Rotary. One of Rotary's things that we work on is water, access to water around the world. the first thing we work on is polio, but eradicating polio, but access to water. So I've seen, the statistics and the programs. There are so many people that don't have water, and where people can't live, I'll use the word normal life. Now that's way below our standards, but where they can't have some sort of normal life, and that causes instability, and that makes it a national security effect. So I think water is and will be very important. The next one from Charlie, the impact, and Jim, if I'm going too long, let me know. The impact of deterrence on war casualties is compelling. How can we emphasize this to all citizens so they can see the need for the best defense systems? I would point to Forrest. I would point to, I don't see Sandra out there, but our educational institutions have to teach it. Our K through 12 has to teach it. We as citizens have to understand it and talk about it. And Americans are not very good with history. Again, we all talk from our own backgrounds. And so back again, when I had this command in Europe, I worked very closely with the Brits and the other countries, but the US and Britain pretty much made sure we were together and talked things through and understood each other. The Brit Admiral I worked with understood American history much better than I did. And I really had no idea of his history. I learned that, and I really had to work hard to learn about it. So I don't know, Charlie, if that's a great answer. I think somewhat it was a rhetorical question. But yeah, I think we need to keep that in front of everybody. And that's why it's in the National Defense Strategy. That's why we have the strategies. That's why there was an unclassed summary published. Sometimes in the past, that strategy's been, the strategy is always top secret or secret. But lately, last few decades, we've made it unclassed and we've talked about it. Media's compared COVID deaths to wartime fatalities. I don't know what to make about that. I think, this is from Dara Glass, I think COVID deaths are huge. I think at least half of them were unnecessary. Now, I'm on my own soapbox. We can argue that point, but I think we could have stopped half of those had we as a nation taken a better stance early on and a more coordinated approach. And so those were unnecessary. And it was not about defending our country like a wartime casualty is. It's not about democracy. This was about just defeating the pandemic. And so we could have done better. So I think the COVID deaths are huge. And they are on the order of the recent casualties. 500,000. World War II total World War II casualties. Charlie, maybe you can help me with some others, but I think the total was it was a million or two. But even so, without fighting a war, without going through 4 years of trenches, we're, fifth of the way there already. So it is huge, but they're different things. That's what I would say there. Vaccine is key to defeating pandemic. Yet we only see offer the vaccine, being willing. From Mike Budney, I'll read it rather than slur my words here. Vaccine is key to defeating the pandemic. Yet we see only 50 to 60% of folks offered the vaccine being willing to take it. How do we quickly act to improve trust to get through this? Assertions by leadership doesn't seem to be changing minds. Mike, I think minds are changing. It'll play out once we have enough vaccine and it's not a scarcity, then we'll really, I guess, have to see. I'm always the eternal optimist, so I hope we get through this. But we got to get to 70, 80%. And maybe to state the obvious of what this group knows, if we need to get to those numbers of vaccine, certainly to protect ourselves and the people we run up against. But if we don't, that 20 or 30% that don't get vaccinated will allow the virus to mutate and change and stay with us forever. Our hope of getting rid of it, the scientists say, is to make it so it can't propagate, and that means all of us get the vaccine. So, Mike, I don't know. In my Sunday school this past weekend, we had in our group a lady who's in charge of one of the senior homes, care homes, and she very proudly said that she that week had gotten all of the people in her home with 2 doses, all of them vaccinated. And so we applauded her. And then she said, but sadly, only 70% of my staff has agreed to be vaccinated. So maybe that proves your point. I guess we need to all work on that. I think I saw Colin Aiken Standard on here. Colin, whatever the Aiken Standard can do to get us all thinking we should be vaccinated is great for national security. Let's see.
Chuck, I think there's one more. So why don't you see that one? Do you see that about population?
Do you see?
There's 2 sitting
Okay.
there.
2 more.
2 more from the bottom going up. Okay. Do you see global and U.S. overpopulation as a current or pending threat to U.S. and global security? It's not in the document, at least as a headliner for those things I listed. I don't see that so much as an issue as these other things are. I think we have been able to, technology has been able to progress to take care of the population that we have. Now, all the points I just made obviously are arguable, but I think we should spend our time on the other things mentioned here. And I would put climate certainly before trying to control population. I do think climate is a national security issue. And I would, we all have stories there. I've had the opportunity to drive my submarine under ice, and I reflect back on where that ice line was in the Arctic, how far down it came, how far we had to go under ice. That's all open water today, and clearly something has changed, and clearly it has an effect that we've seen on our weather and lots of other things. In fact, that's the other question. I didn't even see that. Your thoughts on potential effects of climate change with regards to national defense. Same with what we as a country and the world are doing and not doing with regards to climate change, including the Paris Treaty. That's from CNTA. So yeah, back to treaties. I think being inside the Paris Treaty is very important, and I think that allows us to affect what the world does. And if we're not there, then we're not there. We're irrelevant. The world will go on without us. Even more important is some of the trade discussions. I won't necessarily say treaties, but what's going on in the Pacific. We walked back from many institutions, not treaties so much, but institutions and arrangements in the Pacific. And China stepped in and has taken our place. And so we lose leadership. We lose the effect to use those instruments for our own national interest, which is what we've done. And maybe that's selfish, but that's what national security is about. We've done that since the 50s until now. Now we're getting back in it again, and I think that's very important. So I hope that some of these answers to these questions obviously are my own view. The pitch I gave earlier was I tried to reflect what the national strategy said, and so with that, unless there's any last questions, I'll pause. Thank you very much for your quiet attendance. You're not throwing anything at me.
Thank you, Chuck. And as you showed earlier, you can display your CNTA mug as ceremonial right now. We would be giving him a second mug to complete his set, and we'd fill that up with candy. And the next time we see you, Chuck, we owe you a mug filled with candy. But we so much appreciate your great presentation and your insight into this important issue.